Alright, so Horizon Forbidden West just launched on the PC today, 5 o'clock my time, and today we'll be testing the performance on PC with an RTX 4070 Super. That 4070 Super is paired with an Intel i5 a 14600KF CPU, and that again is paired with DDR5 a 6400 megatransfers per second CL32 memory. I've got all the specs on the screen right now. So today we'll be doing the tests in reverse. Once again, we'll be starting at 4K, then we'll move down to 1440p, and then down to 1080p. Alright, so at the moment we're at 4K, but not really benchmarking settings just yet. So let's go over the settings here quickly. Currently we're at 4K, and these are all the settings here. I do have DLSS enabled here, but I'm going to just enable DLAA and disable frame generation. Right, so this is just for native display testing, and then graphics is set to very high. I mean, I did select the very high preset, and then I'm just upping anisotropic filtering here to 16 times, and that's basically all that I changed there. And I'm going to be testing in this small area here. It is quite a demanding area. I don't want to spoil anything too much, but it definitely it'll give you an idea of what the performance is like. And as you can see, native DLAA 4K on the very highest settings without any upscaling or frame generation, we are getting almost 60 frames per second on the 4070 Super. Not terrible at all. I mean, this GPU is targeted as a 1440p GPU, or the marketing is targeted towards a more 1440p gameplay. And for it to almost maintain 60 frames per second, almost hit 60 frames per second, I should say, in a very, very good looking game at 4K native with DLAA, I think that's pretty impressive actually, and all the while using 220 watts of power. So just one thing, I don't know what they did here, but the textures, like on the rocks and on the ground, everything just looks phenomenal, like especially the textures. If we have a look at these rocks here, these are at 4K obviously, and it really looks really good. All right, so that's native. So if you want to get 60 frames per second, I think DLSS quality should get you there. Let's go ahead and enable that quickly. So just note that I do have dynamic resolution scaling disabled. You can enable it to and set a target of 60 frames per second. It'll then dynamically adjust the resolution, but for benchmarking purposes, we're not going to be doing that. So we'll just be using DLSS set to quality with no frame generation here. And if we go back to the game and refresh our numbers, now we're getting 74 frames per second. Well, I did think we'll be able to maintain 60 frames per second. A little bit further on, it does get slightly more demanding, but not much. I did play a little bit. I just started a new game for the benchmarking run here. The game looks, it really looks brilliant. I did notice some ghosting issues with the DLSS and frame generation. Not even with frame generation, just look at her hair. I'm not sure if it'll come across in the YouTube video, but there is some ghosting, some artifacting there. Maybe they can sort that out. It's not the end of the world. I do think that if you adjust the sharpness and motion blur and all that kind of stuff, you should be able to get rid of the ghosting there to a certain degree anyway. But there you go, maintaining 60 frames per second at 4K with the DLSS set to quality. So not really 4K, but on the highest setting, definitely commendable. All right, so let's go ahead and just see if we can actually get a higher frame rate by just enabling frame generation. I think it's here. So we've got frame generation. Remember, we had around 70 frames per second, give or take. And that's good enough for you to start enabling frame generation. I do recommend a base frame rate of around 60 frames per second before enabling it, because it does increase input latency. And the higher your base frame rate, the less impactful the additional input latency would be. So still getting around 90 frames per second, so almost a high refresh rate experience here on a very gorgeous, good looking game, and not even aggressive upscaling, right? So I do think Nixus did a very good job here with the port. It looks great, it runs great so far, and color me impressed. I mean, this is not even really a very high-end GPU. This is considered mid-range, spec-wise, not price-wise. All right, so let's lower the quality preset here. So if we go to graphics, let's just set it to high. You'll see that it does set it to 4 times anisotropic. I'm just going to set it back to 16. So just remember the high preset just with the 16 times anisotropic filtering. It just makes the textures look a little bit better, especially in the distance. So let's go ahead and do that. But then also we're just going to disable frame generation here, and we'll use DLAA again. So native 4K just on the high preset without any frame generation. Let's see what the difference is in performance. Nothing. So going from very high to high netted us basically nothing, which is kind of strange. I mean, all our everything else looks pretty much the same. It does seem like the highs are slightly higher. I mean, I saw a 58 there, but on average it looks pretty much the same, and the frame time graph is not really that smooth looking. We are looking at frame times of around 20 milliseconds at times. I mean, that's 50 frames per second. So let's just see what happens if we just drop this down to the medium preset. Or I'm just going to drop this down to 4 times, right? So now it's really the high preset. Let's see if it actually makes a difference in the performance. I don't think it would. It doesn't. Okay, so I mean that basically affects VRAM more than anything. Okay, so if we go ahead and drop this down to medium, everything is medium, 2 times anisotropic. Like this, you can really bump up if you've got the VRAM. I don't think it needs to be that low. So let's see. And now we are almost at 60 frames per second native. Like, it's really not... I do think it'll probably be better just to enable the high preset or the very high preset, just as DLSS quality, to get 60 frames per second, because over here we are on the medium preset and we're not able to maintain 60 frames per second. It does dip below 60 at times. Like, that's still a very good experience, but if you're targeting for a locked 60, it might not satisfy your needs unless you enable DRS, which is dynamic resolution scaling. I'm pretty sure it'll maintain 60 frames per second then. Alright, so lastly, let's just enable the low preset and whatever that's called. I think it's called the low preset. I just did check earlier. So now we've got trilinear texture filtering, not even anisotropic. Does it have bilinear as well? No, so only trilinear and anisotropic. That's good. So let's see what our frame rate boost here is. Like 5 frames per second. Okay, 5, 6, so 10% boost in the frame rate here. It'll probably still drop below 60 frames per second at times. So actually, the very high preset DLSS quality is your best bet at 4K if you are using an RTX 4070 Super. I'm pretty sure an RTX 4070 would be able to hit 60 frames per second as well with the DLSS set quality at 4K. I mean, once again, it's not 4K because it's upscaled 4K, but you know what I mean. But even on low, the game does still look pretty good, but there is definitely significant less detail on the ground here. Well, it's maybe just my imagination, but it does look slightly less detailed, but that's to be expected. The water looks pretty good. Everything else, the low preset still looks pretty decent, right? But once again, the very high preset with the DLSS quality, and maybe enable frame generation if you want just a slightly higher frame rate. Alright, sorry, just before we drop the resolution, I'm back at 4K here and just on the very high preset still, and I just want to check other DLSS methods here. So I'm on DLSS balance at the moment with no frame generation. So let's just get our numbers back up here, and getting 80 frames per 70. Not sure there was a big increase going from DLSS quality to DLSS balanced. So we are hitting just over 90 frames per second, cresting the hill there. I mean, this is definitely not terrible considering we're running at very high with the 4K resolution output. So definitely, I'm getting stuck. Definitely not terrible at all. So let's just see if we enable DLSS frame generation here quickly, if that increases our frame rate a little bit. So let's just enable that. So we went from around 80 to just over 90, 100 frames per second there. Let's just see what happens once we crest the hill here, if she can stop coughing. So 100, I mean, we didn't gain that much by enabling frame generation. So once again, it's just, you know, the GPU is slightly limited with these settings, so frame generation is not going to help that much. All right, so let's just see what happens if we then just use another or a more aggressive upscaling here. If we just drop this down to performance and just disable frame generation, just making sure everything is off, etc. So let's do that. Oops. And we're really not gaining much here, which is quite strange. So the game definitely doesn't scale that well with the DLSS settings. But just looking at it, like you wouldn't say that this is DLSS performance. It really does look very good with the 4K output. We managed to hit 100 frames per second, cresting the hill there. So like 3 frames per second better than with DLSS balanced. And I'm just going to stand still here and see if we actually can see a difference with frame generation. Although I highly doubt it. I think the results would be pretty similar. So, sorry. If we look there, 88 frames per second. And then if we go ahead and enable frame generation with DLSS set to performance. So 88 goes to 104. Okay, so there we go. If we want a decent, close to a high refresh rate experience at 4K output, DLSS performance, which renders internally at 1080p, then upscales to 4K with frame generation, gets us just over 100 frames per second here. And as I mentioned earlier, the game still looks extremely good. You can notice some fuzziness or fizziness or blurriness or whatever you want to call it in the grass during movement, but this game does look very good. I'm not going to deny that. I've been looking forward to this game for quite a bit. I was actually looking forward a little bit more to Dragon's Dogma 2, but I've seen some of the early performance reviews, and it's going to be a shocker when it comes to performance unless there's a good day one patch. So I just decided to buy this game instead and do a few videos on it. All right, now it's time to drop the resolution to 1440p. Right, we're now back on the very high preset, just once again enabling 16 times anisotropic. We're at 1440p, DLAA, so no dynamic resolution scaling, no frame generation, no upscaling whatsoever, and no VSync, so off we go. Right, so once again, just going to be testing in this small area, and I did test this earlier, spoiler alert, I did not drop below 60 frames per second once during my hour of testing or so, and at these settings. So if you are aiming for a consistent 60 frames per second, this will get you that. You can maybe just lock the frame rate to 60 frames per second even, and you'll have a very, very smooth frame time graph as well. So the frame pacing would be very even as well, and it's a very, very smooth experience. I'd assume a lot of people would be playing this with the controller. I personally did. I played Horizon Zero Dawn with the controller on the PC, but mainly because I played it on the PS4 Pro when it launched. And then if you do play with the controller, the input latency is even less noticeable at lower frame rate. Alright, let's go ahead and enable DLSS here, and then we'll enable some frame generation as well. Once again, we'll just use DLSS set to quality and no frame generation for now, and go ahead and see what kind of performance gains we get. There we go, so we're almost getting a high refresh rate experience, depending on what you call it, or a high refresh rate experience. Obviously, I consider 120 frames per second that, but I mean, 90 frames per second and above, definitely very, very smooth looking, the motion fluidity. Whoops, what's happening there? This keyboard of mine is very, very weird. I never double tapped, but it does dive. Anyway, this is just my benchmarking PC's keyboard. I do need a new keyboard. Anyway, so got an average of 107 frames per second here at 1440p with DLSS set to quality on the very high preset. Definitely very decent for the RTX 4070 Super, I'd say. Average of 105, and our 1% and 0.1% lows are sitting at 77 and 69 respectively, and also very respectable. Right, now I'm just going to enable some frame generation here, and then we'll move the presets down a bit. Alright, so DLSS quality frame generation enabled, still on the very high preset, just with the 16 times anisotropic filtering, and let's enable all that. And now we are getting 120 frames per second. Are we using, okay, so I just do that to make sure that there's no frame rate cap, because previously I did see that it locks to 120 frames per second, which made me believe VSync was maybe enabled or something. Anyway, so running around here, getting a high refresh rate experience, and even with the keyboard and mouse, the input latency is definitely not really noticeable to somebody like me, but that's maybe just a skill issue. I do like frame generation, whether it's from AMD or Nvidia. FSR3's frame generation does have some issues in some games, but generally I do like the tech. I do prefer a high refresh rate experience. So that's just my opinion. You can use frame generation and you can't. There are people that like it. There are some people who don't like it. To each their own, right? Luckily, that's what PC gaming is all about. There's a setting for literally everybody. Alright, so an average there of 123 frames per second. Our 1% laser sitting at 107, and our 0.1% laser sitting at 79. Now, strangely enough, our VRAM usage is sitting at 7.3 gigs, so definitely not even a VRAM intensive game either. So very, very good, very well optimized for a launch title, I'd say, so far. Alright, let's move down the presets a little bit and see what kind of performance we're getting. Sorry, before we do that, I just want to enable DLAA and then frame generation. So no upscaling, just with frame generation enabled. Yeah, I do have Reflex enabled as well. Just want to see what kind of performance we are getting here. Remember, DLSS frame generation does not increase performance. It's inserting fake frames, interpolated frames, getting around 90, 100 frames per second here. I do feel the input latency slightly more than when DLSS quality was enabled. I'll do a little bit of a more in-depth video, including latency, etc. What you can, or the latency that GeForce Experience actually reports on, just to give you a better idea. Once again, playing with the controller, you probably won't feel this. But with a keyboard and mouse, I can now slightly feel the latency. But if you do want native resolution with very, very good anti-aliasing, that's what DLAA is all about. DLAA with frame generation, you can consider it. Otherwise, just run native DLAA without frame generation or any upscaling, and you'll get 60 frames per second plus anyway. Alright, now it's time to change the presets a little bit. Right, so we're just going to try the high preset once again. There was no difference at 4K, so I just want to see if there's a difference at 1440p. Let's just make sure the frame generation, all that kind of stuff is disabled. So no frame gen, no DLSS upscaling, and just a high preset. We got between 60 and 70 frames per second previously. Now getting 80 frames per second. So, I mean, going up to 90 there. So there is I think there's a slight increase in performance at 1440p, dropping down to the high preset. I mean, over there we almost hit 100 frames per second. So if you are aiming for around 90 frames per second, the high preset probably will get you close to that, closer to 90 more often than not, I do think. But alright, just looking at the graphs here, definitely on the low preset, the grass had a lot less detail. All right, just making sure of that, but still a very good experience. These games function very well at 60 frames per second. It's not the fastest paced first person shooter game, so 60 frames per second is perfectly fine. But me personally, I do like a high refresh rate experience, as I've said multiple times in the video. So that's basically what I'm personally aiming for. Right, so let's see if we drop this down to the medium preset. I just want to see if we can get a constant 90 frames per second. Not that there's any value in that beyond just seeing 90 frames per second on the monitor. You won't notice the difference between 80 and 90 frames per second just by looking at it, right? Interestingly enough, we actually gained quite a bit dropping down to the medium preset. So we're still not there where we were with the very high preset and DLSS set to quality. I mean, over here we were getting just over 130 frames per second, and average was just, well, in the mid 120s. So definitely consider using the high or the very high preset with a little bit of upscaling. The upscaling tech in this game is pretty good, the upscaling implementation, so not a lot of visual quality loss there. Alright, so I'm just going to use the medium preset again, and as we are now going to enable some DLSS and then some frame generation, just for those of you who are insane and want like 200 frames per second. Let's see if we can actually get that. Right, so just DLSS quality here, and go ahead and apply that. So if we go ahead and refresh our numbers, now getting 150 frames per second, well, actually feels very good. This is a very, very fluid and responsive game now. 160 frames per second, 170 frames per second. We're still not CPU bound. Look at the GPU usage. We are running at 99% GPU usage there. And frame generation is not even enabled. So frame generation, when you are GPU bound, generally increases your frame rate by around 30%. Like, I mean, it does differ from game to game, but that's just pretty much what I've seen, around 30%. But once you start being CPU bound, that increase can actually increase to 50% and above, right? But we're not CPU bound, and got an average there of 153 frames per second. 1% laser sitting at 118 and 0.1% laser at 107. So definitely a very, very good experience. All right, let's enable frame generation and actually see how high we can push the frame rate here. All right, everything is still the same, and let's go ahead. Okay, so are we tapping out at 150 frames per second here? Just want to see something. If we disable frame generation here, do we actually see a difference? I've seen this before where frame generation does not make a difference at all. Okay, so 147 frames per second, and with the frame generation enabled, that goes to 150 something. Okay, so doesn't make a big difference when we are sitting at 100 and something frames per second, 150 something frames per second. So we gained 7-8 frames per second, yeah. So there goes our dream. No more 200 frames per second. I don't think it's doable with this specific GPU. Maybe at 1080p, although like we'd need to get that without frame generation. We need to get close to that, because as you can see, frame generation did not increase our frame rate that much. It did on the higher quality settings, so it's maybe just that the GPU is running out of steam, pushing these high frame rates, that frame generation is just not able to insert interpolated frames quickly enough for a meaningful difference. But I mean, that's pure speculation. Alright, that's it for 1440p. Let's go down to 1080p. Alright, and there we go, 211 frames per second. Alright. So if we actually just play the game the way it should be played, let's just go down. I know that there's maybe not a lot of people playing at 1080p with an RTX 4070 Super. There are some people who want a higher frame rate, and that's perfectly fine. Like you use the GPU as you see fit, however you want. That's why I'm testing at all the different resolutions here. Unfortunately, I don't have an ultra-wide monitor. Otherwise, I would have tested at ultra-wide resolutions as well. So, alright, here we go at 1080p on the very high preset. Getting maybe slightly more than... Okay, now it climbed up a little bit. Definitely more than at 1440p now. It took a little bit of time to actually increase that much, but it's fluctuating quite a lot. Sure, previously when we crested this hill, it also fluctuated quite a bit, but we're going from 130 down to the 90s, so not that consistent. Alright, but just some very short runs here at 1080p. Got an average there of 104, 1% laser sitting at 74, and our 0.1% laser sitting at another respectable 69. Ah, damn it, there it changes. Alright, so I'm just going to leave it on the very high preset here. Let's enable some DLSS. Although I'm not the biggest fan of upscaling at 1080p. I've mentioned it before. I'll mention it again. It does become slightly blurry. Sometimes it can still look better than native DLAA implementations. When people say that, we don't mean that the resolution itself looks better. It's just that the anti-aliasing looks better with the DLSS. But over here, DLSS at 1080p, I do start to notice it in the foliage in the distance, especially. There's a lot of artifacting, not artifacting, but shimmering and detail missing, blurriness, a little bit of fuzziness. Not entirely sure how to explain it. English is not my native language, but it does look kind of blurry. We did gain a little bit in the frame rate there, so if that's what you're looking for, there you go. You can use DLSS to increase your frame rate a little bit. And if we then enable frame generation here, let's go ahead and do that quickly. So from 110 to 135 frames per second. Now the game just, the motion fluidity is just amazing. Like at 144 frames per second, it's it's unlike any Horizon Zero Dawn game that I've tried before. I mean, the PC version of Horizon Zero Dawn did not have frame generation, so you had to lower the settings quite a bit and use aggressive upscaling to actually hit these kind of frame rates. And with the help of frame generation, this game can actually push higher frame rates than Horizon Zero Dawn that came before it, right? Obviously at the expense of some artifacting, some visual quality loss, and some input latency. Just look at the tip of her bow. If I move, there's quite a bit of ghosting there. That's just, especially if there's stuff in the background, like that's just what you'll have to contend with if you use DLSS at these low resolutions, right? But I just wanted to test that anyway. As you can see, we're still not CPU bound, which is quite impressive considering we're not even running at 1080p. We're running lower than 1080p with DLSS set to quality. So let's just drop all this down. Sorry, I did not mean to apply all that kind of stuff. I just wanted to drop this down to the medium preset and then disable DLSS just with DLAA and no frame generation here. Let's see, medium preset, native DLAA. Still getting 140 frames per second, right? So now we are getting, actually we're getting a high frame rate at 1440p medium than at a very high using DLSS and frame generation. So this is actually, there we go, 199 frames per second. So if you want to max out a 165 Hz monitor, there you go. Here's the settings you need to use. At 1080p on the medium preset, native. There you go. Getting a pretty high refresh rate experience. And our lows are actually very respectable as well. Right, an average there of 160 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 119, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 110. So now if we go ahead and enable, that's not there. If we enable DLSS here quickly, so just the DLSS set to quality, and there we go. So now we've got, so let me just reset the numbers, 178 frames per second. I think it feels very good. Like it definitely, it's very, very, very smooth. To 109 frames per second cresting this hill. That's impressive. And still not CPU bound. Like that's impressive. I think this game is extremely GPU bound, but not that GPU heavy, if that makes sense. Means that it's not really relying that much on the CPU in the specific area, and not that GPU heavy that we are struggling to get high frame rates. So 192 frames per second average there, sitting at 178 at the moment. So let's see if we enable frame generation. I'm just going to leave the overlay open there. If we enable frame generation here, do we actually get a bump in the frame rate? 178 going to 180. Okay, so no. If you already have a very high frame rate, obviously there's no need to then enable frame generation, but it does not help at all either. 209 was our max, and we did not hit 209 there. I've seen this before where frame generation does not increase the frame rate that much. As I said, it's possible that we are already running at such a high frame rate that the interpolated frames just can't be inserted fast enough. Alright, I think that's going to be it for this video. I just wanted to do a quick short video on Horizon Forbidden West. I'll be doing a little bit more in-depth analysis a little bit later down the line when I've got some more time. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.